The photograph arrived just after 9 a.m., long before the sun had fully broken through the coastal haze that hung over Portsmouth. Laura Chin found it propped upright against her front door, sealed inside a rigid archival envelope, the kind used by museums and institutions rather than casual clients. A faint salt smell clung to it, perhaps from the storage facility, perhaps from the house it had lived in for a century. Hannah Baker's note was brief, written in a careful, almost hesitant script. Found among my grandmother's belongings with no names attached. Please restore if possible. And tell me anything you can about the people. Laura read the line twice. Clients rarely asked for anything you can tell me. That phrasing carried its own quiet urgency. She slit the envelope along its edge, slid out the heavy cardstock, and exposed the image to the gray morning light. A wedding portrait. 1920. Studio-lit, formal, composed with the mechanical exactness of early professional photography. At first glance, it looked conventional. A bride in pale silk, a groom in a dark suit with a pocket watch chain, and behind them two additional figures, man and woman, standing stiffly as though they had been instructed not to breathe. But even before she recognized the era, the gelatin silver texture, or the telltale haloing of the flash lamp, Laura felt an unease that had nothing to do with deterioration. The bride, young, no more than 17, wasn't smiling. Her lips were pressed so tightly together they seemed almost bloodless. And the groom, older, shockingly older, perhaps 50 or more, wore an expression Laura had seen only a handful of times in her work, a look of ownership disguised as affection. She turned the photograph over. No writing. No studio mark. No date stamp. No embossed border. It was as if the image had been intentionally stripped of identifiers. Laura exhaled slowly. This wasn't going to be an ordinary restoration. Laura set the photograph beneath the cool beam of her table lamp, sliding on nitro gloves with the practiced steadiness of someone who had handled hundreds of fragile histories. At this early stage she wasn't yet searching for tragedy, only for the subtle distortions of age, silvering, foxing, abrasions. But the image resisted neutrality. The longer she looked, the more the composition unsettled her. The groom, George Blackwood, as she would later learn, stood too close to the girl. His hand was placed on her shoulder not with affection, nor even with stiffness, but with a tight, proprietary pressure that distorted the drape of her gown. The fingers lay rigid, each one slightly separated, as though braced. The posture of a man ensuring compliance, not celebrating union. The bride, whom the future would name Ellie Martin, stared past the camera with a brittle, frightened stillness. Her eyes were wide, but not in the usual nervousness of youth at a studio portrait. They held a glazed tension, as if fear had reached a point just before breaking. Laura leaned closer. The girl's jaw was clenched, a slight tremor blurred the edge of her chin, a detail nearly invisible except under direct light. Behind them stood the two figures Laura had initially assumed were guests, an older man and woman whose clothes were formal but plain. Their placement was unusual. Wedding attendants were typically arranged beside the couple with a symmetry meant to flatter the scene. Here, they stood apart, shoulders angled inward but eyes cast down. Neither looked at the camera. Neither looked at Ellie. Their hands were clasped in front of them, tense, knuckles pale beneath the emulsion's silver sheen. Guardians, Laura thought suddenly. Not guests at all. Their avoidance of the lens was not shyness, it was shame, or fear, or both. She adjusted the lamp, letting the angled light expose surface discrepancies. A faint disturbance appeared near Ellie's left shoulder, an area of retouching, executed with more haste than sk*ll. The early studios often softened blemishes or reduced glare, but this alteration had the unmistakable quality of concealment, not correction. Laura sat back slowly, the photograph growing heavier in her hands. Something in this portrait had been forced, not only the moment, but the entire arrangement. Whatever story Hannah Baker hoped to recover from her grandmother's belongings, it had not been preserved willingly. "Who were you?" Laura murmured to the silent figures. "And what were you afraid of?" The photograph offered no answer. But its silences had begged *N to speak. By late afternoon the coastal light had dimmed enough for Laura to begin the high-resolution scan. She preferred working at dusk. The quiet helped her register subtleties she sometimes missed in daylight. She placed the photograph on the scanner bed, aligned the edges with surgical precision, and initiated a slow, meticulous pass. The machine's faint hum filled the studio, steady as a heartbeat. The first enlarged preview appeared on her monitor, far sharper than the naked eye permitted, and with it came confirmation of what her instincts had already whispered. Ellie's eyes, when magnified, showed rims swollen and reddened, not from allergies or poor lighting but from recently suppressed crying. The tear ducts glistened as tiny reflective points, captured accidentally by the studio lamp a century earlier. Fear, Laura thought, is sometimes recorded more faithfully than joy. She zoomed outward. The groom's hand, the one clutching Ellie's shoulder, revealed something more disturbing in close detail. The tension in his fingers was not simply a matter of posture. The tendons stood out sharply, as if exerting continual force. She followed the line of his arm to his jaw, set in an expression that, enlarged, carried a faint upward curl. Not a smile, but satisfaction. The Guardians, she reminded herself, harbored their own evidence. The man's right hand, barely visible at standard scale, showed broken skin across the knuckles. At high resolution, the abrasions became clear, scabbed over, patterned as though from contact with a rough surface or a desperate struggle. The woman beside him kept her hands clasped so tightly that indentations from her nails appeared along the soft tissue of her palms. Laura shifted her focus to Ellie's collarbone. There, beneath the lace edge of the gown, the scanner exposed a faint discoloration, an oval bruise, lightly retouched by the photographer's brush. The concealment was crude but purposeful. Someone had tried to erase harm from the record. The image, now stripped of its protective distance, seemed to pulse with unspoken violence. Laura felt a tightening in her chest, a sensation she had experienced before, when encountering photographs that bore witness to what had been endured in silence. She saved each section meticulously, labeling them with clinical restraint. But as she hovered over Ellie's face once more, enlarged to the size of her palm, she felt an unease deeper than professional obligation. This was no ordinary restoration. It was evidence, muted, flattened, but insistent, of a story that had refused to stay hidden. And the photograph, she sensed, was only the first doorway. Laura began her archival research with the assumption any New Englander would make, a Portsmouth client, a 1920 wedding portrait attire, indicating a mid-Atlantic studio. Boston seemed the obvious starting point. She entered queries for Martin, Blackwood, and wedding notices 1920 into regional databases, expecting at least a birth record or a society column. Mention. Nothing. She expanded to Massachusetts statewide records. Still nothing. The absence felt deliberate, as though the photograph had been severed from the context that should have anchored it. She shifted to occupational directories, searching for photographers whose work matched the portrait's stylistic cues. Only one studio on the East Coast specialized in that exact lighting ratio in the early 1920s, a facility once located in Richmond, Virginia. The discovery jolted her expectations. Why would a New Hampshire family hold a wedding portrait from a southern studio with no family names attached? She continued searching, entering the terms separately: Ellie Martin, George Blackwood, Guardians, Richmond marriage, 1920. At first the results returned scattered fragments, unrelated families, mismatched dates. Then, through a cross-referenced legal database rarely consulted for genealogical work, a single entry appeared. Commonwealth of Virginia vs. Martin Manufacturing Company, filed May 1920. Withdrawn June 1920. Her pulse quickened. She opened the file summary. The plaintiffs were listed as Thomas Martin and his wife, guardians to minor Eleanor Martin. The defendant was the Blackwood Transportation Company, a freight and railway conglomerate owned by George Blackwood. The details contained only terse legal phrasing. Indebtedness, asset seizure pending. And a final line that chilled her, case resolved through private settlement 10 days prior to Martin, Blackwood wedding. Laura leaned back slowly. The implication was unmistakable. Whatever debt the guardians owed, whatever leverage Blackwood possessed, the wedding had not been an independent event, it was the resolution. But why had the case been withdrawn so abruptly? And why did the guardians in the photograph appear less victorious than condemned? She dug further, locating an article from a Richmond paper dated April 1920. A fire had destroyed a small manufacturing building Martin owned, leaving the family with a collapsed business and substantial liabilities. The creditor listed was Blackwood's company. A suspicious fire. A sudden lawsuit. A forced settlement. The elements aligned with a grim precision. Laura closed her laptop, the dim room echoing with the hum of her equipment. The photograph's silence had turned into a whisper. The archival traces now murmured a darker question. What exactly had been exchanged to settle that debt, and who had paid the true price? The next clue arrived not through a database but through coincidence, one of those improbable alignments that archivists learn to treat with caution. On a Saturday morning, Laura attended a small flea market in Baltimore while visiting a friend. She had no intention of working, she simply wandered between tables of discarded objects. Yet her habits guided her inevitably toward a booth selling vintage paper ephemera, postcards, ledgers, notebooks whose owners had long vanished. A weathered leather-bound book caught her eye. Its spine was cracked, its pages foxed at the edges. When she opened it, she found faint pencil sketches of studio layouts, placement diagrams, exposure notes, reminders about lens plates. Beneath one sketch was a name written in looping script. Studio, J. R. Hollingsworth, Richmond. The same studio she had suspected. She flipped further, uncertain whether she was chasing confirmation or coincidence. Most entries were mundane, supply lists, payment tallies, portrait appointments. But tucked near the back, on a page trembled by pressure as though the writer's hand had not been steady, she found a single note. June 1920. Private commission. Bride issued as collateral for family debt. Groom coercive. Guardians present under duress. This was not union, this was transaction. Laura felt the air constrict. The words were not cryptic, they were brutally plain, a testimony the photographer had never intended for public view. She read the lines again, noticing the final sentence added in smaller, hurried writing. Cause of debt not the father, partner stage death, fled. Family trapped. She closed the notebook slowly, as if afraid the fragile binding might dissolve under the weight of its truth. The implications were harrowing. Ellie Martin had not been surrendered for a legitimate debt. She had been sacrificed for the deceit of another, a man who vanished and left his surviving relatives defenseless before Blackwood's demands. If the photographer had risked writing this, even in private, he must have understood the gravity of what he witnessed. Studio workers in 1920 depended on patronage. To document such a matter was to record something dangerous. Laura purchased the notebook without negotiation. The vendor, unaware of its significance, handed it over casually. Yet as Laura tucked it into her bag, she felt as though she were carrying evidence, something that demanded not just analysis, but responsibility. Back in her hotel room, she set the notebook beside her laptop and the scanned portrait. The three artifacts formed a small constellation of truth: a photograph of a frightened girl, a withdrawn lawsuit, and the testimony of a photographer who had seen too much. And yet Laura sensed the portrait was still only the surface. The real story lay beyond the frame, hidden in the years that followed, in the path Ellie carved for herself after surviving the transaction meant to erase her will. Once the photographer's notebook confirmed the coercion, Laura turned her attention to the years following the wedding, years the public record rendered strangely faint, as though Ellie had slipped behind a veil. Marriage certificates from Richmond showed the union registered properly, with George Blackwood listed as husband and Eleanor Martin Minor, as bride. But after 1920, the trail thinned almost to extinction. The 1921 and 1922 city directories listed her only as Mrs. G. Blackwood, tucked beneath her husband's entry. There were no photographs, no society page appearances, no charitable events, a void in a life that should have generated documentation. Then, abruptly, in 1925, a petition appeared in the Richmond courthouse, Eleanor M. Blackwood versus George L. Blackwood, petition for separation, citing cruelty. The document contained almost nothing beyond the legal minimum, but one line struck like a hammer. Petitioner asserts continuous threat to her safety. The petition was denied. The judge, notably aligned with the business elite, ruled the evidence insufficient. 2 months later, George Blackwood suffered a stroke. The obituary presented it as sudden and natural, but the tone was unusually curt, almost perfunctory, for a man of his stature. Ellie was named widow and heir to his personal effects, not the empire itself, which passed to distant cousins. Yet what followed was stranger still. Immediately after the estate's settlement, Ellie vanished from Richmond records entirely. Laura traced her through fragments. A hotel ledger in Philadelphia signed by E. Martin. A sewing machine purchased under the name Ella Morton in 1928. A brief employment card from a Providence textile mill belonging to Ellen M. Each breadcrumb suggested careful concealment rather than aimless escape. The aliases were close enough to remember, distant enough to misdirect. By 1933, an entry surfaced in the Providence Business Registry. Ellie Martin, dressmaker. The name reclaimed. The address modest. Beside it, in smaller handwriting, an added note. Studio supports local women's legal fund. The convergence struck Laura deeply. A girl once traded as collateral now funding legal protection for others. She sat back, absorbing the arc. Ellie had fled, hidden, rebuilt, but she had not remained silent. She had turned survival into resistance. Laura returned her gaze to the restored portrait on her screen. The terrified bride's eyes, once so clouded with dread, seemed altered now, not in the photograph itself, but in Laura's understanding. This image, long buried, was no longer simply evidence of harm. It had become proof of endurance, the first chapter in a life reclaimed against all intention. And Laura sensed, with a quiet ache, that returning this truth to Hannah Baker would mean returning to a family not a tragedy, but a lineage of defiance. When Laura finally arranged to meet Hannah Baker, she chose a quiet corner of a small cafe near Market Street, neutral ground, a place where difficult truths could be spoken gently. Hannah arrived carrying the same archival envelope, her movements careful, almost reverent. She was younger than Laura expected, perhaps mid-20s, with a nervous earnestness that spoke of someone bracing for an answer she both needed and feared. Laura spread the documents across the table slowly. The restored photograph, the lawsuit summaries, the studio notebook pages preserved in digital facsimile. She explained each discovery with the deliberate calm of someone who understood that knowledge could wound as much as it healed. Hannah listened with her hands clasped tightly, her breath shallow. When Laura reached the part about the private settlement, Hannah closed her eyes. So Ellie was traded, she whispered. My grandmother never spoke of anything like this. She may not have known, Laura said. These histories are often buried before they reach the next generation. Hannah nodded, tears welling. But she kept the photograph. Laura turned the image so it faced Hannah fully. Even in its restored clarity, Ellie's terror was unmistakable. Yet now, knowing the arc of her life, the portrait seemed to hold dual truths, captivity and survival interwoven in a single moment. Hannah studied Ellie's face for a long time. Her hands trembled, but not with shock, rather with recognition, an ancestral echo rising through silence. Does it end there? She finally asked. Laura shook her head and slid forward the Providence Registry entry, the note about the legal aid fund, the proof of Ellie reclaiming her surname. She didn't disappear into suffering, Laura said. She built something. She protected others from what happened to her. A long quiet followed, dense, almost sacred. Hannah pressed her fingertips to the photograph, not touching Ellie's image but hovering just above it, as though offering a gesture of respect. My grandmother always said our family came from women who survived things they never spoke of, she murmured. I didn't know she meant this. Laura felt the weight of the moment settle between them. The restored portrait, once an artifact of coercion, had become a bridge connecting past and present, a testimony reclaimed rather than mourned. Before leaving, Hannah asked if she could keep the high-resolution scan. It's not a pretty picture, she said quietly, but it's the truest one we have. As she walked away, clutching the envelope to her chest, Laura remained seated for a moment longer. The cafe's slow hum drifted around her, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet she felt the gravity of what had been returned to the world, a story no longer buried, a life no longer distorted by silence. And in that restored truth, etched first in fear, then in defiance, Ellie Martin's presence endured, unbroken.